I see you're not asleep yet. You don't have to stay awake. Welcome to Boring Fantasy for Sleep. Phantastes, a Faerie romance by George MacDonald, 1858. Episode 4. In Episode 3, Anodos found the marble woman inside the alabaster block and freed her with his breath and his hands and his longing. She stepped out of the stone and walked away from him without looking back. He followed into the forest, into the dark. Tonight, something follows him. It has no face. It makes no sound. It is simply there, wherever he goes, a darkness that falls on everything he looks at. This is Episode 4, The Shadow, Chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Chapter 8. I am a part of the part, which at first was the whole. Goethe. Mephistopheles in Faust. My spirits rose as I went deeper into the forest, but I could not regain my former elasticities of mind. I found cheerfulness to be like life itself, not to be created by any argument. Afterwards I learned that the best way to manage some kinds of pain-filled thoughts is to dare them to do their worst, to let them lie and gnaw at your heart till they are tired, and you find you still have a residue of life they cannot kill. So, better and worse, I went on, till I came to a little clearing in the forest. In the middle of this clearing stood a long, low hut, built with one end against a single tall cypress, which rose like a spire to the building. A vague misgiving crossed my mind when I saw it, but I must needs go closer and look through a little half-open door near the opposite end from the cypress. Window I saw none. On peeping in and looking towards the further end, I saw a lamp burning with a dim reddish flame, and the head of a woman bent downwards as if reading by its light. I could see nothing more for a few moments. At length, as my eyes got used to the dimness of the place, I saw that the part of the rude building near me was used for household purposes, for several rough utensils lay here and there, and a bed stood in the corner. An irresistible attraction caused me to enter. The woman never raised her face, the upper part of which alone I could see distinctly. But as soon as I stepped within the threshold, she began to read aloud, in a low and not altogether unpleasing voice, from an ancient little volume, which she held open with one hand on the table, upon which stood the lamp. What she read was something like this: So then, as darkness had no beginning, neither will it ever have an end, so then, is it eternal? The negation of aught else is its affirmation. Where the light cannot come, there abideth the darkness. The light doth but hollow a mine out of the infinite extension of the darkness, and ever upon the steps of the light treadeth the darkness, yea, springeth in fountains and wells amidst it, from the secret channels of its mighty sea. Truly, man is but a passing flame, moving unquietly amid the surrounding rest of night, without which he yet could not be, and whereof he is in part compounded. As I drew nearer, and she read on, she moved a little to turn a leaf of the dark old volume, and I saw that her face was sallow and slightly forbidding. Her forehead was high, and her black eyes repressedly quiet. But she took no notice of me. This end of the cottage, if cottage it could be called, was destitute of furniture, except the table with the lamp, and the chair on which the woman sat. In one corner was a door, apparently of a cupboard in the wall, but which might lead to a room beyond. Still, the irresistible desire which had made me enter the building urged me. I must open that door and see what was beyond it. I approached and laid my hand on the rude latch. Then the woman spoke, but without lifting her head or looking at me. "You had better not open that door." This was uttered quite quietly, and she went on with her reading, partly in silence, partly aloud, but both modes seemed equally intended for herself alone. The prohibition, however, only increased my desire to see, and as she took no further notice, I gently opened the door to its full width and looked in. At first, I saw nothing worthy of attention. It seemed a common closet, with shelves on each hand, on which stood various little necessaries for the humble uses of a cottage. In one corner stood 1 or 2 brooms, in another a hatchet and other common tools, showing that it was in use every hour of the day for household purposes. But as I looked, I saw that there were no shelves at the back, and that an empty space went in further, its termination appearing to be a faintly glimmering wall or curtain, somewhat less, however, than the width and height of the doorway where I stood. But as I continued looking, for a few seconds towards this faintly luminous limit, my eyes came into true relation with their object, all at once, with such a shiver as when one is suddenly conscious of the presence of another in a room where he has, for hours, considered himself alone. I saw that the seemingly luminous extremity was a sky, as of night, beheld through the long perspective of a narrow dark passage. Through what, or built of what, I could not tell. As I gazed, I clearly discerned 2 or 3 stars glimmering faintly in the distant blue. But suddenly, and as if it had been running fast from a far distance for this very point, and had turned the corner without abating its swiftness, a dark figure sped into and along the passage from the blue opening at the remote end. I started back and shuddered, but kept looking, for I could not help it. On and on it came, with a speedy approach but delayed arrival, till, at last, through the many gradations of approach, it seemed to come within the sphere of myself, rushed up to me, and passed me into the cottage. All I could tell of its appearance was that it seemed to be a dark human figure. Its motion was entirely noiseless, and might be called a gliding, were it not that it appeared that of a runner, but with ghostly feet. I had moved back yet a little to let him pass me, and looked round after him instantly. I could not see him. "Where is he?" I said in some alarm to the woman who still sat reading. "There, on the floor, behind you," she said, pointing with her arm half outstretched, but not lifting her eyes. I turned and looked, but saw nothing. Then, with a feeling that there was yet something behind me, I looked round over my shoulder, and there, on the ground, lay a black shadow, the size of a man. It was so dark that I could see it in the dim light of the lamp, which shone full upon it, apparently without thinning at all the intensity of its hue. "I told you," said the woman, "you had better not look into that closet." "What is it?" I said, with a growing sense of horror. "It is only your shadow that has found you," she replied. "Everybody's shadow is ranging up and down looking for him. I believe you call it by a different name in your world. Yours has found you, as every person's is almost certain to do who looks into that closet, especially after meeting one in the forest, whom I dare say you have met." Here, for the first time, she lifted her head and looked full at me. Her mouth was full of long, white, shining teeth, and I knew that I was in the house of the ogre. I could not speak, but turned and left the house, with the shadow at my heels. A nice sort of valet to have, I said to myself bitterly as I stepped into the sunshine, and looking over my shoulder, saw that it lay yet blacker in the full blaze of the sunlight. Indeed, only when I stood between it and the sun was the blackness at all diminished. I was so bewildered, stunned, both by the event itself and its suddenness, that I could not at all realize to myself what it would be to have such a constant and strange attendance, but with a dim conviction that my present dislike would soon grow to loathing, I took my dreary way through the wood. Chapter 9. O Lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is her wedding garments, ours her shroud. Ah, from the soul itself must issue forth a light, a glory, a fair luminous cloud, enveloping the earth, and from the soul itself must there be sent a sweet and potent voice of its own birth. Of all sweet sounds, the life and element. Coleridge. From this time until I arrived at the palace of Fairyland, I can attempt no consecutive account of my wanderings and adventures. Everything, henceforward, existed for me in its relation to my attendant. What influence he exercised upon everything into contact with which I was brought may be understood from a few detached instances. To begin with, this very day on which he first joined me, after I had walked heartlessly along for 2 or 3 hours, I was very weary and lay down to rest in a most delightful part of the forest, carpeted with wildflowers. I lay for half an hour in a dull repose, and then got up to pursue my way. The flowers on the spot where I had lain were crushed to the earth, but I saw that they would soon lift their heads and rejoice again in the sun and air. Not so those on which my shadow had lain. The very outline of it could be traced in the withered, lifeless grass, and the scorched and shriveled flowers which stood there, dead and hopeless of any resurrection. I shuddered and hastened away with sad forebodings. In a few days, I had reason to dread an extension of its baleful influences from the fact that it was no longer confined to one position in regard to myself. Hitherto, when seized with an irresistible desire to look on my evil demon, which longing would unaccountably seize me at any moment, returning at longer or shorter intervals, sometimes every minute, I had to turn my head backwards and look over my shoulder, in which position, as long as I could retain it, I was fascinated. But one day, having come out on a clear grassy hill, which commanded a glorious prospect, though of what I cannot now tell, my shadow moved round and came in front of me. And presently, a new manifestation increased my distress, for it began to coruscate and shoot out on all sides a radiation of dim shadow. These rays of gloom issued from the central shadow as from a black sun, lengthening and shortening with continual change. But wherever a ray struck, that part of earth, or sea, or sky, became void and desert and sad to my heart. On this, the first development of its new power, one ray shot out beyond the rest, seeming to lengthen infinitely until it smote the great sun on the face, which withered and darkened beneath the blow. I turned away and went on. The shadow retreated to its former position, and when I looked again, it had drawn in all its spears of darkness and followed like a dog at my heels. Once, as I passed by a cottage, there came out a lovely fairy child with 2 wondrous toys, one in each hand. The one was the tube through which the fairy-gifted poet looks when he beholds the same thing everywhere. The other that through which he looks when he combines into new forms of loveliness, those images of beauty which his own choice has gathered from all regions wherein he has travelled. Round the child's head was an aureole of emanating rays. As I looked at him in wonder and delight, round crept from behind me a something dark, and the child stood in my shadow. Straightway, he was a commonplace boy, with a rough, broad-brimmed straw hat, through which brim the sun shone from behind. The toys he carried were a multiplying glass and a kaleidoscope. I sighed and departed. One evening, as a great silent flood of western gold flowed through an avenue in the woods, down the stream, just as when I saw him first, came the sad knight, riding on his chestnut steed. But his armour did not shine half so red as when I saw him first. Many a blow of mighty sword and axe turned aside by the strength of his mail, and glancing adown the surface, had swept from its path the fretted rust, and the glorious steel had answered the kindly blow with the thanks of returning light. These streaks and spots made his armour look like the floor of a forest in the sunlight. His forehead was higher than before, for the contracting wrinkles were nearly gone, and the sadness that remained on his face was the sadness of a dewy summer twilight, not that of a frosty autumn morn. He too had met the older maiden as I, but he had plunged into the torrent of mighty deeds, and the stain was nearly washed away. No shadow followed him. He had not entered the dark house. He had not had time to open the closet door. Will he ever look in? I said to myself. Must his shadow find him someday? But I could not answer my own questions. We travelled together for 2 days, and I began to love him. It was plain that he suspected my story in some degree, and I saw him once or twice looking curiously and anxiously at my attendant gloom, which all this time had remained very obsequiously behind me. But I offered no explanation, and he asked none. Shame at my neglect of his warning, and a horror which shrunk from even alluding to its cause, kept me silent, till, on the evening of the 2nd day, some noble words from my companion roused all my heart, and I was at the point of falling on his neck and telling him the whole story, seeking, if not for helpful advice, for of that I was hopeless, yet for the comfort of sympathy, when round slid the shadow and enwrapped my friend, and I could not trust him. The glory of his brow vanished, the light of his eye grew cold, and I held my peace. The next morning we parted. But the most dreadful thing of all was that I now began to feel something like satisfaction in the presence of the shadow. I began to be rather vain of my attendant, saying to myself, in a land like this, with so many illusions everywhere, I need his aid to disenchant the things around me. He does away with all appearances and shows me things in their true colour and form, and I am not one to be fooled with the vanities of the common crowd. I will not see beauty where there is none. I will dare to behold things as they are. And if I live in a waste instead of a paradise, I will live knowing where I live. But of this, a certain exercise of his power, which soon followed, quite cured me, turning my feelings towards him once more into loathing and distrust. It was thus. One bright noon, a little maiden joined me, coming through the wood in a direction at right angles to my path. She came along singing and dancing, happy as a child, though she seemed almost a woman. In her hands, now in one, now in another, she carried a small globe, bright and clear as the purest crystal. This seemed at once her plaything and her greatest treasure. At one moment, you would have thought her utterly careless of it, and at another, overwhelmed with anxiety for its safety. But I believe she was taking care of it all the time, perhaps not least when least occupied about it. She stopped by me with a smile and bade me good day with the sweetest voice. I felt a wonderful liking to the child, for she produced on me more the impression of a child, though my understanding told me differently. We talked a little and then walked on together in the direction I had been pursuing. I asked her about the globe she carried, but getting no definite answer, I held out my hand to take it. She drew back and said, but smiling almost invitingly the while, "You must not touch it." Then, after a moment's pause, "Or if you do, it must be very gently." I touched it with a finger. A slight vibratory motion arose in it, accompanied or perhaps manifested by a faint sweet sound. I touched it again, and the sound increased. I touched it the third time. A tiny torrent of harmony rolled out of the little globe. She would not let me touch it anymore. We travelled on together all that day. She left me when twilight came on, but next day, at noon, she met me as before, and again we travelled till evening. The third day, she came once more at noon, and we walked on together. Now, though we had talked about a great many things connected with fairyland and the life she had led hitherto, I had never been able to learn anything about the globe. This day, however, as we went on, the shadow glided round and enwrapped the maiden. It could not change her, but my desire to know about the globe, which in his gloom began to waver as with an inward light, and to shoot out flashes of many-coloured flame, grew irresistible. I put out both my hands and laid hold of it. It began to sound as before. The sound rapidly increased, till it grew a low tempest of harmony, and the globe trembled and quivered and throbbed between my hands. I had not the heart to pull it away from the maiden, though I held it in spite of her attempts to take it from me. Yes, I shame to say, in spite of her prayers, and at last, her tears. The music went on growing in intensity and complication of tones, and the globe vibrated and heaved, till at last it burst in our hands, and a black vapour broke upwards from out of it, then turned, as if blown sideways, and enveloped the maiden, hiding even the shadow in its blackness. She held fast the fragments, which I abandoned, and fled from me into the forest in the direction whence she had come, wailing like a child, and crying, "You have broken my globe. My globe is broken. My globe is broken." I followed her, in the hope of comforting her, but had not pursued her far, before a sudden cold gust of wind bowed the treetops above us, and swept through their stems around us. A great cloud overspread the day, and a fierce tempest came on, in which I lost sight of her. It lies heavy on my heart to this hour. At night, ere I fall asleep, often, whatever I may be thinking about, I suddenly hear her voice, crying out, "You have broken my globe. My globe is broken." My globe. Here I will mention one more strange thing, but whether this peculiarity was owing to my shadow at all, I am not able to assure myself. I came to a village, the inhabitants of which could not at first sight be distinguished from the dwellers in our land. They rather avoided than sought my company, though they were very pleasant when I addressed them. But at last I observed that whenever I came within a certain distance of any one of them, which distance, however, varied with different individuals, the whole appearance of the person began to change, and this change increased in degree as I approached. When I receded to the former distance, the former appearance was restored. The nature of the change was grotesque, following no fixed rule. The nearest resemblance to it that I know is the distortion produced in your countenance when you look at it as reflected in a concave or convex surface, say, either side of a bright spoon. Of this phenomenon, I first became aware in rather a ludicrous way. My host's daughter was a very pleasant, pretty girl who made herself more agreeable to me than most of those about me. For some days, my companion's shadow had been less obtrusive than usual, and such was the reaction of spirits occasioned by the simple mitigation of torment that, although I had cause enough besides to be gloomy, I felt light and comparatively happy. My impression is that she was quite aware of the law of appearances that existed between the people of the place and myself, and had resolved to amuse herself at my expense. For one evening, after some jesting and raillery, she, somehow or other, provoked me to attempt to kiss her. But she was well defended from any assault of the kind. Her countenance became, of a sudden, absurdly hideous. The pretty mouth was elongated and otherwise amplified sufficiently to have allowed of 6 simultaneous kisses. I started back in bewildered dismay. She burst into the merriest fit of laughter and ran from the room. I soon found that the same undefinable law of change operated between me and all the other villagers, and that, to feel I was in pleasant company, it was absolutely necessary for me to discover and observe the right focal distance between myself and each one with whom I had to do. This done, all went pleasantly enough. Whether, when I happened to neglect this precaution, I presented to them an equally ridiculous appearance, I did not ascertain, but I presume that the alteration was common to the approximating parties. I was likewise unable to determine whether I was a necessary party to the production of this strange transformation, or whether it took place as well, under the given circumstances, between the inhabitants themselves. Chapter 10. From Eden's bowers the full-fed rivers flow, to guide the outcasts to the land of woe. Our earth, one little toiling streamlet yields, to guide the wanderers to the happy fields. After leaving this village, where I had rested for nearly a week, I travelled through a desert region of dry sand and glittering rocks, peopled principally by goblin fairies. When I first entered their domains, and indeed, whenever I fell in with another tribe of them, they began mocking me with offered handfuls of gold and jewels, making hideous grimaces at me, and performing the most antic homage, as if they thought I expected reverence and meant to humour me like a maniac. But ever, as soon as one cast his eyes on the shadow behind me, he made a wry face, partly of pity, partly of contempt, and looked ashamed, as if he had been caught doing something inhuman. Then, throwing down his handful of gold and ceasing all his grimaces, he stood aside to let me pass in peace, and made signs to his companions to do the like. I had no inclination to observe them much, for the shadow was in my heart as well as at my heels. I walked listlessly and almost hopelessly along, till I arrived one day at a small spring, which, bursting cool from the heart of a sun-heated rock, flowed somewhat southwards from the direction I had been taking. I drank of this spring, and found myself wonderfully refreshed. A kind of love to the cheerful little stream arose in my heart. It was born in a desert, but it seemed to say to itself, "I will flow and sing and lave my banks till I make my desert a paradise." I thought I could not do better than follow it and see what it made of it. So down with the stream I went, over rocky lands, burning with sunbeams. But the rivulet flowed not far before a few blades of grass appeared on its banks. And then, Here and there, a stunted bush. Sometimes it disappeared altogether underground. And after I had wandered some distance, as near as I could guess, in the direction it seemed to take, I would suddenly hear it again, singing, sometimes far away to my right or left, amongst new rocks, over which it made new cataracts of watery melodies. The verdure on its banks increased as it flowed. Other streams joined it. And at last, after many days' travel, I found myself, one gorgeous summer evening, resting by the side of a broad river, with a glorious horse chestnut tree towering above me and dropping its blossoms, milk white and rosy red, all about me. As I sat, a gush of joy sprang forth in my heart and overflowed at my eyes. Through my tears, the whole landscape glimmered in such bewildering loveliness that I felt as if I were entering fairyland for the first time, and some loving hand were waiting to cool my head, and a loving word to warm my heart. Roses, wild roses everywhere. So plentiful were they. They not only perfumed the air, they seemed to dye it a faint rose hue. The colour floated abroad with the scent, and clomb, and spread, until the whole west blushed and glowed with the gathered incense of roses, and my heart fainted with longing in my bosom. Could I but see the spirit of the earth, as I saw once the indwelling woman of the beech tree, and my beauty of the pale marble, I should be content. Content. Oh, how gladly would I die of the light of her eyes. Yea, I would cease to be, if that would bring me one word of love from the one mouth. The twilight sank around and enfolded me with sleep. I slept as I had not slept for months. I did not awake till late in the morning, when, refreshed in body and mind, I rose as from the death that wipes out the sadness of life, and then dies itself in the new morrow. Again I followed the stream, now climbing a steep rocky bank that hemmed it in, now wading through long grasses and wild flowers in its path, now through meadows, and anon through woods that crowded down to the very lip of the water. At length, in a nook of the river, gloomy with the weight of overhanging foliage, and still and deep as a soul in which the torrent eddies of pain have hollowed a great gulf, and then, subsiding in violence, have left it full of a motionless, fathomless sorrow. I saw a little boat lying. So still was the water here, that the boat needed no fastening. It lay as if someone had just stepped ashore, and would in a moment return. But as there were no signs of presence, and no track through the thick bushes, and moreover, as I was in fairyland, where one does very much as he pleases, I forced my way to the brink, stepped into the boat, pushed it, with the help of the tree branches, out into the stream, lay down in the bottom, and let my boat and me float whither the stream would carry us. I seemed to lose myself in the great flow of sky above me, unbroken in its infinitude, except when now and then, coming nearer the shore at a bend in the river, a tree would sweep its mighty head silently above mine, and glide away back into the past, never more to fling its shadow over me. I fell asleep in this cradle, in which Mother Nature was rocking her weary child, and while I slept, the sun slept not, but went round his arched way. When I awoke, he slept in the waters, and I went on my silent path beneath a round silvery moon, and a pale moon looked up from the floor of the great blue cave that lay in the abysmal silence beneath. Why are all reflections lovelier than what we call the reality? Not so grand or so strong it may be, but always lovelier. Fair as is the gliding sloop on the shining sea, the wavering, trembling, unresting sail below is fairer still. Yea, The reflecting ocean itself, reflected in the mirror, has a wondrousness about its waters that somewhat vanishes when I turn towards itself. All mirrors are magic mirrors. The commonest room is a room in a poem when I turn to the glass. And this reminds me, while I write, of a strange story which I read in the Faerie Palace, and of which I will try to make a feeble memorial in its place. In whatever way it may be accounted for, of one thing we may be sure, that this feeling is no cheat, for there is no cheating in nature, and the simple unsought feelings of the soul. There must be a truth involved in it, though we may but in part lay hold of the meaning. Even the memories of past pain are beautiful, and past delights, though beheld only through clefts in the grey clouds of sorrow, are lovely as fairyland. But how have I wandered into the deeper fairyland of the soul, while as yet I only float towards the fairy palace of fairyland, the moon, which is the lovelier memory or reflex of the down-gone sun. The joyous day seen in the faint mirror of the brooding night had wrapped me away. I sat up in the boat. Gigantic forest trees were about me, through which, like a silver snake, twisted and twined the great river. The little waves, when I moved in the boat, heaved and fell with a plash as of molten silver, breaking the image of the moon into 1,000 morsels, fusing again into one, as the ripples of laughter die into the still face of joy. The sleeping woods, in undefined massiveness, the water that flowed in its sleep, and above all, the enchantress moon, which had cast them all, with her pale eye, into the charmed slumber, sank into my soul, and I felt as if I had died in a dream, and should never more awake. From this, I was partly aroused by a glimmering of white that through the trees on the left vaguely crossed my vision as I gazed upwards. But the trees again hid the object, and at the moment, some strange melodious bird took up its song and sang, not an ordinary bird song, with constant repetitions of the same melody, but what sounded like a continuous strain in which one thought was expressed, deepening in intensity as evolved in progress. It sounded like a welcome already overshadowed with the coming farewell. As in all sweetest music, a tinge of sadness was in every note. Nor do we know how much of the pleasures even of life we owe to the intermingled sorrows. Joy cannot unfold the deepest truth, although deepest truth must be deepest joy. Cometh white-robed sorrow, stooping and wan, and flingeth wide the doors she may not enter. Almost we linger, with sorrow for very love. As the song concluded, the stream bore my little boat with a gentle sweep round a bend of the river. And lo, on a broad lawn, which rose from the water's edge, with a long green slope, to a clear elevation from which the trees receded on all sides, stood a stately palace, glimmering ghostly in the moonshine. It seemed to be built throughout of the whitest marble. There was no reflection of moonlight from windows. There seemed to be none. So there was no cold glitter. Only, as I said, a ghostly shimmer. Numberless shadows tempered the shine, from column and balcony and tower. For everywhere, galleries ran along the face of the buildings. Wings were extended in many directions, and numberless openings through which the moonbeams vanished into the interior, and which served both for doors and windows, had their separate balconies in front, communicating with a common gallery that rose on its own pillars. Of course, I did not discover all this from the river and in the moonlight. But though I was there for many days, I did not succeed in mastering the inner topography of the building. So extensive and complicated was it. Here I wished to land, but the boat had no oars on board. However, I found that a plank, serving for a seat, was unfastened, and with that, I brought the boat to the bank and scrambled on shore. A deep, soft turf sank beneath my feet as I went up the ascent towards the palace. When I reached it, I saw that it stood on a great platform of marble, with an ascent by broad stairs of the same all round it. Arrived on the platform, I found there was an extensive outlook over the forest, which, however, was rather veiled than revealed by the moonlight. Entering by a wide gateway, but without gates, into an inner court, surrounded on all sides by great marble pillars, supporting galleries above, I saw a large fountain of porphyry in the middle, throwing up a lofty column of water, which fell, with a noise as of the fusion of all sweet sounds, into a basin beneath, overflowing which, it ran into a single channel towards the interior of the building. Although the moon was by this time so low in the west that not a ray of her light fell into the court over the height of the surrounding buildings, yet was the court lighted by a second reflex from the sun of other lands. For the top of the column of water, just as it spread to fall, caught the moonbeams, and like a great pale lamp hung high in the night air, threw a dim memory of light, as it were, over the court below. This court was paved in diamonds of white and red marble, according to my custom since I entered Fairyland, of taking for a guide whatever I first found moving in any direction. I followed the stream from the basin of the fountain. It led me to a great open door, beneath the ascending steps of which it ran through a low arch, and disappeared. Entering here, I found myself in a great hall, surrounded with white pillars, and paved with black and white. This I could see by the moonlight, which, from the other side, streamed through open windows into the hall. Its height I could not distinctly see. As soon as I entered, I had the feeling so common to me in the woods that there were others there besides myself, though I could see no one, and heard no sound to indicate a presence. Since my visit to the Church of Darkness, my power of seeing the fairies of the higher orders had gradually diminished until it had almost ceased, but I could frequently believe in their presence while unable to see them. Still, although I had company, and doubtless of a safe kind, it seemed rather dreary to spend the night in an empty marble hall, however beautiful, especially as the moon was near the going down, and it would soon be dark. So I began at the place where I entered, and walked round the hall, looking for some door or passage that might lead me to a more hospitable chamber. As I walked, I was deliciously haunted with the feeling that behind some one of the seemingly innumerable pillars, one who loved me was waiting for me. Then I thought she was following me from pillar to pillar as I went along. But no arms came out of the faint moonlight, and no sigh assured me of her presence. At length I came to an open corridor, into which I turned. Notwithstanding that, in doing so, I left the light behind. Along this I walked with outstretched hands, groping my way, till arriving at another corridor, which seemed to strike off at right angles to that in which I was. I saw at the end a faintly glimmering light, too pale even for moonshine, resembling rather a stray phosphorescence. However, where everything was white, a little light went a great way. So I walked on to the end, and a long corridor it was. When I came up to the light, I found that it proceeded from what looked like silver letters upon a door of ebony, and to my surprise, even in the home of wonder itself, the letters formed the words, "The Chamber of Sir Anodos." Although I had as yet no right to the honours of a knight, I ventured to conclude that the chamber was indeed intended for me, and opening the door without hesitation, I entered. Any doubt as to whether I was right in so doing was soon dispelled. What to my dark eyes seemed a blaze of light burst upon me. A fire of large pieces of some sweet-scented wood, supported by dogs of silver, was burning on the hearth, and a bright lamp stood on a table in the midst of a plentiful meal, apparently awaiting my arrival. But what surprised me more than all was that the room was in every respect a copy of my own room, the room whence the little stream from my basin had led me into fairyland. There was the very carpet of grass and moss and daisies, which I had myself designed, the curtains of pale blue silk that fell like a cataract over the windows, the old-fashioned bed with the chintz furniture on which I had slept from boyhood. Now I shall sleep, I said to myself. My shadow dares not come here. I sat down to the table and began to help myself to the good things before me with confidence. And now I found, as in many instances before, how true the fairy tales are. For I was waited on all the time of my meal by invisible hands. I had scarcely to do more than look towards anything I wanted when it was brought me, just as if it had come to me of itself. My glass was kept filled with the wine I had chosen, until I looked towards another bottle or decanter, when a fresh glass was substituted, and the other wine supplied. When I had eaten and drank more heartily and joyfully than ever since I entered fairyland, the whole was removed by several attendants, of whom some were male and some female, as I thought I could distinguish from the way the dishes were lifted from the table, and the motion with which they were carried out of the room. As soon as they were all taken away, I heard a sound as of the shutting of a door, and knew that I was left alone. I sat long by the fire, meditating, and wondering how it would all end. And when at length, wearied with thinking, I betook myself to my own bed, it was half with the hope that, when I woke in the morning, I should awake not only in my own room, but in my own castle also, and that I should walk out upon my own native soil and find that fairyland was, after all, only a vision of the night. The sound of the falling waters of the fountain floated me into oblivion. We stopped at the end of chapter 10. Anodos carries the shadow now. He did not choose it. He cannot put it down. Wherever he goes, the shadow falls between him and the world. The marble lady is still ahead of him somewhere. The forest is still around him. But things look different in the shadow. Things that were beautiful become ordinary. Things that were strange become merely odd. That is the cost of what he lost in the cottage. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Episode 5 is The Palace of Four Queens, chapters 11 and 12. Moth does not mind if you fall asleep before the end. Continue to listen to Velicor Dark Academia.